Hello, hello. I'm your co host for today, Dr. Carrie Jones, and I am really excited to bring on my friend, Dr. Maya Shetreat. She is both an adult and pediatric neurologist, an herbalist, an author, and formulator of quantum drops. We went into the science of psychedelics. A lot of people have questions around psychedelics. They have a pretty negative view around psychedelics, understandably, given the history. But we really talked about the research, the effect on neurotransmitters, what they're doing now in different universities, including the VA Medical Hospital, and more. So if you've been curious around psychedelics, how to start with psychedelics, or even how to start with something lighter and softer as it maybe relates to things that you're going through, then you're going to want to listen up as Dr. Maya, a neurologist herself, walks us through the basics of all things psychedelic. Dr. Maya Shetreat, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I am so excited to have you on the show today.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
Well, this is a big one for a lot of people because you are an extremely well-trained neurologist who got into master plant medicine. And honestly, I can't wait to pick your brain about it because I've heard you lecture multiple times. I get your newsletters. I, of course, love your quantum drops. And given the amount of interest and curiosity and sometimes fear around where psychedelics can come into play to help better our health, it's not, a lot of people think, oh my gosh, I don't do that. I don't want to go, that's a trip. Like, no. I'm going to bring on a neurologist expert and she's going to walk us through it. So that's the direction we are headed today for all the listeners. Are you ready?
You can never be ready.
So the first thing I want to ask you, because before I want to set the stage of like maybe why somebody might think this is an important conversation. And one of the things I've heard you talk about and I've seen you write about is you talk about cellular memory. And you talk about like physical and mental health conditions that childhood trauma can instigate. I've heard you talk about autoimmune and other chronic conditions. So let's start there to sort of set the stage for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's so important because the way that most of us were taught, whether we are healthcare practitioners or patients, that illness or conditions or diagnoses come about is, well, it could be genetic or it could be something has gone wrong with our bodies, right? Physically, usually. And even, the way we talk about mental health disorders is in a very now physical way, right? It's like a deficit of something or too much of another thing. So what we're learning, the deeper we go into the microbiome, into epigenetics, into a lot of these kind of more cutting edge. I know it doesn't feel cutting edge, but when I first started out, a lot of this was cutting edge still, is that we actually, yes, have genetic and epigenetic material that informs illness. And yes, we do have disruptive events in life and can be physical, among others, that can be disruptive. But what we actually know is that trauma now actually disrupts the microbiome. It actually embeds in us. Okay. And just to be clear, our experiences and trauma itself, trauma is not what happens to us, it's how it embeds into us. So that is cellular memory, right? Like if you think about growing up, and if you're someone with siblings, I am in fact not someone with siblings, but I know many siblings who would look back at their family life and one person will say, I had a lot of trauma. And the other person would be like, no, I didn't. We didn't have trauma in our family, right? Like there could be a real difference. And one person might have been really flattened by their family experience or by their school experience, whereas other people may not be. And that has to do with our particular interpretation, our lens, and how those experiences embed. Now, what does cellular memory mean? Cellular memory is basically the cells understand many different languages. They understand physical insults or experiences. They understand the mental, they understand emotional, and they understand the spiritual, right? They understand any kind of insult or any kind of experience. The way they communicate it tends to be physical. So we send in these messages to our cells. Our cells literally reconfigure down to the level of our mitochondria. And I always talk in my lectures about the spaghetti and meatballs, which is the way our mitochondria actually reconfigures in the face of cell danger, in the face of a trauma experience of some kind at the level of the cell. Mitochondria are sentinels for what's happening in the body, right? And around the body. So mitochondria that are like, this is happy, healthy, optimal function. I'm in growth mode. I'm in, beneficial mode. They're like branch spaghetti. They're shaped like branch spaghetti, and they can touch one another. They exchange information. They exchange nutrients. They get rid of waste. Whereas when a cell is in danger mode, right? So these sentinel mitochondria sampling the environment, they're like, oh, no, 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 no. They actually will ball up into meatballs, and they look like meatballs. If you look at the microscopy, they look like meatballs as opposed to spaghetti. And when they're in meatball mode, in cell danger mode, these mitochondria do not exchange information in the same way. They don't exchange nutrients. They don't get rid of waste, and they are not in a growth configuration. They are in a protection and defense configuration. And what that leads to on a cellular level is, over time, if it doesn't recover in a timely way, it can lead to inflammation. It can lead to hormonal disruption. It can lead to allergies, autoimmunity, nervous system dysregulation, and all of the conditions, chronic conditions that so many of us are dealing with right now. So we never really, I think, made or had this connection in the medical world, right? Because we're so like, it's physical, it's science, everything has to be like seen and obvious, to be like, oh, an emotional experience being something that actually could lead to schizophrenia, that could lead to major depression, that could lead to an autoimmune disease. And now we know adverse childhood events, these ACEs, which are sometimes very severe things, but sometimes they're things like going through divorce as a kid, or having a family member with addiction, or experiencing like mental or physical abuse, which unfortunately, these are things that many, many people experience to different degrees. Those are associated with chronic illness in young adults and actually long-term with mitochondrial dysfunction. Literally, the mitochondria are not producing as much energy over our lifespan when we have experienced traumas that we don't know how to manage or metabolize. And that is what cellular memory kind of encompasses.
And can this happen as an adult? Like, let's say you go through a divorce as an adult, or you have a traumatic event, a horrible car accident as an adult, or something terrible as an adult. Then from that point forward, as we sometimes say, quote, I was never well since. Can that do it as well, on top of or in addition to or aside to childhood events?
Absolutely. So the reason childhood is so impactful is because in early years of life, particularly the ages of 0 through 7, we are in these critical periods of plasticity. So there are like these window periods where we are more fertile for anything that happens to us, good or bad, to embed in us. And therefore, in that time, those experiences, they're harder to reverse. They become part of our like unconscious programming. What happens later in life absolutely can do the very same kinds of things. Oftentimes, we don't have those window periods of plasticity. So a lot of times what's happening is a later traumatic experience is actually building already on someone who's vulnerable because of things that happened earlier in life. But it's absolutely possible that a significant trauma or experience that is physically, mentally, emotionally disruptive can lead to that same thing, right? As you said, I was never the same after that.
And given your extensive training and background and history, this is a whole new world. And because most of the time when somebody has a chronic illness, autoimmune development, we're looking for, well, what's the virus? What's the bacteria? What's the mold? We're looking for what caused the thing, something we can kill or eradicate or go after. And in this new view of medicine, this is something that can be absolutely embedded, cellularly embedded from a long time ago, from one of these triggers, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And what's even more complex here is epigenetics. So if you think about, I had a lovely childhood. I don't really remember it, right? But, your grandparents were refugees, right? Or they lived through a famine, or your mother was abused by her parent, or whatever it may be, right? That there are things that are embedded that we don't even always really know how to unpack. And I'm not saying this in any way to be hopeless or like we can never figure it out, but sometimes it's not a figure outable thing. And I think that's important because a lot of people in the functional medicine world, and I practiced in pediatric and adult neurology for a very long time and worked with people who had been to 15 other, 20 other hospitals, practitioners, centers, gone all over the world. So there's this sense of sometimes hopelessness that can come along with this feeling of like, will I ever get better? I have to find out what happened. And sometimes that's actually not how we get better, right? And I think I know that's very counterintuitive in the way we think about things now and the way we think about functional medicine. And I think true functional medicine actually has a lot of space for this. Like I know Dr. Bland also has always brought in the emotional and spiritual into the conversation about our physical and mental health.
Yeah. And unfortunately, in conventional medicine, there's not a lot of space for the emotional, spiritual part of it. When you have 7 minutes in a visit and you're talking about your autoimmune, let's say you have Hashimoto's, you have MS, you have rheumatoid arthritis, just to stick with something a lot of people might be familiar with, but it could be something like chronic back pain or, chronic knee pain or chronic headaches. In 7 minutes, it's hard to say, tell me about your upbringing. Tell me about your background. Tell me emotionally what's going on.
Well, yeah. And I think a lot of doctors, for example, don't want to have that conversation anyway, because they're not really given a lot of context or background or training to go into those deep waters. It happens. Obviously, those conversations do happen, even probably not in the 7-minute visits, but they do happen. And, I would say just as an example about chronic back pain, that when we have chronic physical pain, that's a perfect example of cellular memory. A cell very often, and we might have had a physical trauma. It doesn't preclude that cellular memory sitting in the body. It's like cellular memory basically says there's a pain message here. Maybe it was emotional, maybe it was physical, maybe it was mental, maybe it was all of the above. I'm going to transmit it as physical pain in the body, right? And what I would say is like one person gets in a car accident, another person gets in a car accident. They have the same kind of injury, maybe no health issues, no pain issues, no nothing before. One person ends up derailed for years and years and years, and the other doesn't. If we kind of go back and look at that person's story, sometimes there's something there that is right, that needs to be looked at. But it's very difficult too, because our whole society is built on persona. It's built on this, right? Instagram, like looking good and sending out these good messages and seeming successful. And I know, and I think you probably know too, because we talk to people behind closed doors, people from all walks of life, people from all kinds of backgrounds, wildly successful, well-known to not really well-known people, the gamut, right? Everybody has pain of some kind in their lives. Everybody has suffering, no matter how great they look forward facing. And that's something that our modern society doesn't really create space for, right? For us to metabolize. I don't think that's pathology, by the way. I don't want to say I don't think trauma is pathology, because that's not exactly true. I think trauma is common. It's not normal, but it's common. And I think it's part of the human condition, unfortunately, at least up until now. And I think too that where modern society is really failing us is we don't have ritual and ceremony and rites of passage to allow us communally and individually to metabolize and make meaning of those experiences. So we sit around chronically ill. And I think that's a way in which our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our spirits are screaming out for that ability to metabolize and make meaning, right? It's like that's what chronic conditions, a lot of these chronic conditions in part are telling us. It doesn't mean the physical stuff, the nutrition, the supplements, the herbs, the lifestyle, all of those things are obviously tremendously important. I'm not negating that. I'm just saying, I think there's something much bigger at play.
I was talking with my apprenticeship yesterday, and we were discussing about the health of people that we're seeing in the last couple of years is either younger, harder, and more complex. So conditions, things, symptoms, complaints we used to see maybe in the 5th decade, the 6th, the 7th decade, we're now seeing a 28-year-old, coming in with these significant inflammation and significant heart disease. We're seeing the 32-year-old things I would see in a woman in her 60s or 70s. And this is a great segue into the idea behind psychedelic medicine, because most people think, oh, that's a drug. That's what you do at raves. That's what people did in the 70s. That's what I did in my teens and 20s, not realizing the amount of medical institutions that have realized the importance of them and how they're actually helping. So I want to make this segue into, because of the complexity of what's going on in healthcare in this world, and it seems a lot of what was working is failing, we have a whole new direction that medicine is looking into actively. And I want to really open up that conversation for people who maybe are listening going, yes, that's me. I feel like the medical community is failing me and I've tried everything. Or yes, that's me. I feel like I've had trauma and I have autoimmune or chronic conditions or what have you, where I am that young person who is struggling now when I feel like maybe it's something when I'm older. So let's open the conversation on what's going on in the medical literature, research, institutions, and psychedelics.
Yeah, it's been, the last decade, this has really blown up. And a lot of people don't know that in the 50s and 60s, there actually was a lot of academic research looking at LSD and the psilocybe mushrooms as magic mushrooms, right, is what they're known as, in OCD, in depression, in anxiety. There was a lot of research there, very positive and promising research. And then, the 60s happened and it was a kind of uncontrolled experiment. And, I think we can talk a little bit about that maybe because that's where we get a lot of the stigma, right? Is like what ended up happening is a lot of people in the masses kind of, right, got their hands on psychedelics and there was no container for that. It was sort of like toddlers, right? Getting a toy, and it was like not a toy for just anybody, right? This wasn't something that was meant or ever had been worked with in that way, just kind of on the streets in this sort of without any ceremonial container. And so a lot of people had negative reactions, right, in that context. And so they ended up being categorized as, the most dangerous category of drug, right? And they became illegal. And all the research basically stopped for decades. And then they started to kick up again, really in the, I think, like mid 90s. And what we started to see in research is for things like nicotine addiction. There was a number of studies that looked at nicotine addiction or just smoking cigarettes, right? We don't actually in our society have very good approaches to help people with addiction of any kind, in fact, but especially smoking cigarettes. And this study was counseling a dose of mushrooms with professional support. And this is always the case in any study I'm quoting, professional support before, during, after. Okay. So this is not like I went to a rave and not saying that couldn't help somebody, maybe, but this is, these studies are controlled. And what happened is over 60% of the people not only stopped smoking, but were still abstinent after a year. And that was unprecedented to have that kind of response. Then they looked at major depression, also profound benefit. And again, in most of these cases, this is 1 or 2 doses ever of one of these medicines. They looked at alcohol addiction. They've looked at other kinds of addictions like heroin and meth, for example, OCD, PTSD for vets, right? And this can be, we're talking here about conditions that have very high suicide rates, that are very disabling to people for their lives. And thinking about this, that counseling 1 or 2 doses in most of these cases with mushrooms or psilocybin, which is a compound from the mushroom, and then support afterwards for a period of time changed people's lives forever.
That's amazing, because I've been watching some of the, like, for example, you said PTSD and vets. I've been watching the VA research just as a particular area, niche area. And my husband himself is a 22-year vet. And, friends and colleagues, etc. It's interesting to watch that the VA has started to do these research studies as well. I mean, they're realizing something like cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, which is wonderful. But if somebody's been doing it for years and years and it's not working, they're having to find an alternative method. And the fact that the VA is more open to this is exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I think talk therapy has an incredible role. And at the same time, think about what we talked about before, right? Our mitochondria in meatball mode, our cells in danger mode, our microbiome in completely kind of defensive mode with more pathological organisms, fewer of the beneficial organisms, less diversity, all of these things. What's happening is, I'm not saying talk therapy can't get to that, but what psychedelics do, and we can talk about kind of the physiology of their actions, is they're rewiring and helping our bodies, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual body, as my Indigenous teachers would say, to rewire, right? So it's like a recalibration that's happening all the way from our epigenetics to our brain and nervous system.
I have said this before, and I cannot remember who the researcher was, so I deeply apologize, but he was talking about psilocybin and depression and PTSD. And he described the analogy similar to a snow hill, like a sledding hill in the winter. And you may have heard this analogy too. And he said, if you have depression or PTSD or OCD, when you get on a fresh snow hill, if you're the first kid with a sled, you create the first track. Well, by the mid-afternoon, so many kids have come on the sled track. And so you find yourself as a kid on a sled just defaulting to a particular track because so many kids have gone down that track. And that's the same in the brain. You mentioned plasticity. It's the path of least resistance. It's the path most traveled. That's the way the body's going to go. So if your path most traveled is OCD, PTSD, depression, that's the way you're going to go. And what he said was, in a controlled environment with psilocybin, it wipes the sledding hill clean. And so you want the controlled environment because what you want then is to redirect this next sledder down a path that is not going to necessarily repeat, go down the PTSD, depression, OCD outcomes as an example, but it gives you a whole new world. And I thought that was the greatest analogy for plasticity and then what something like psilocybin can do. So I would absolutely love to go into the physiology of how it works in the brain and what they do and touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I would say about that analogy is, rather than saying that it wipes the hill clean, I would say it gives you kind of the clarity and the courage to try other untrodden paths,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's not like your original path is gone. And that's like, I think, a thing that when people talk about trauma or these kind of stuck pathways that turn into autoimmunity, that turn into hormonal dysregulation, that turn into various kinds of neurologic illnesses, let's say migraines or ADHD or other things, it's like there is rigidity there, right? But we think like this trauma is, we have to get rid of it. It's not really, I don't think, about getting rid of it. It's part of our experience. It's part of what makes us who we are. It's about kind of understanding a bigger picture and being able to, this is sort of the metabolizing, right? It's saying, oh, I see that path, but I don't have to, I can decide to sled over here because look how amazing this looks. It's going to be fun. No one's gone that way yet, right? Or I've never gone that way. It's kind of, right? It gives us, I think, a kind of mental flexibility and emotional flexibility that previously we didn't have, right? That rigidity. And that rigidity comes from something called the default mode network. And the default mode network is a constellation of parts of the brain that are active when we are in default mode, meaning like not in our attentional focus, out in the world, ego self, right? That persona self. It's sort of when our mind is wandering or we're daydreaming or we're worrying or perseverating on things, right? Any of that can happen. And the default mode network is really important in our ego, right? And what it does is it suppresses emotions, it suppresses old memories, traumas, right? That's one of its actions, is to kind of keep us like, right, survival. Like you can't be thinking about like all the things that make you sad or your childhood every minute if you need to like go and, conquer at work every day or, right, achieve and make it on the New York City subway or whatever it may be. So the idea is that with psychedelics, and not just psychedelics, there are other things we can do, like if you're a very experienced meditator or breath work or huge experiences of wonder and on and on. There's other ways, sensory deprivation. But when we have a psychedelic experience, what it does is it takes offline the default mode network. And so what happens is that we're kind of able to come into contact with old experiences or memories and kind of be in inquiry with them, right? And be in sort of a more curious state instead of just telling the same story to ourselves. And one of the things the default mode network does is it controls something called predictive coding. And this is the stuckness thing. This is the going down the same path on the sledding hill every time. The predictive coding is when we walk into a room and we think we see every single detail, right? Like, oh, I know, there's this, there's that, there's whatever, there's the person in the red sweater, there's, people, right? And you make sense of it because you think you're seeing every single detail. You're not. Your brain actually is picking just a few details and building everything else around those few details from old experiences. So right? It's great because survival, right? You can't walk into a room where there's like some danger or something and have to look at 10 million different details and process every single one to make a decision that you got to get out of there. But the problem is that it means we're living from our past experiences, maybe not always in the healthiest ways, right? Yes, we want the wisdom, but no, we don't want to walk into a difficult conversation with our boss or our spouse and be really living in the experience of when you got yelled at by your dad when you were 5 years old, or maybe hit or what, right? Like, because then all these things are triggering this old stuff. So when you take the default mode network and shut down predictive coding for a period of time with psychedelics, it offers that opportunity to see many different paths available to us.
When somebody is doing this in a controlled environment, we learned about this in the research studies, for example, this isn't something like take a dose, go home, and best of luck. Like, this is truly an immersive experience, as you said, more ceremonial in nature versus, as I said, like being given here's a pill, best of, good luck. I'm trying to think of a good way to put it for people who are thinking like, yes, it sounds like me. Like, is this something I can get at Whole Foods? Actually, no.
Well, so it's complicated right now because we do have ketamine clinics. Yes. Ketamine right now is available and legal, and it's not considered like a true classical psychedelic, but it's being used in that way. And people I know who I trust who are doing this work find it to be a true psychedelic experience, totally transformative, very, very beneficial. But some people go to ketamine clinics, right? And they get preparation, they get therapy before and after. It's a series. And some people go, they get the ketamine, they are given a remote to like watch a show on TV and or whatever. And, they're left alone by themselves and that's it. So, and then there are at home ketamine, right? So people actually will get ketamine sent to them at home. So what I'm trying to say here is what psychedelics do is they reopen those critical periods of plasticity, right? We talked about what happens, why the ages of 0 to 7 and even beyond, we have these window periods of plasticity in which things embed in a totally different way than they do most of the rest of our lives. Yes, there are ways that we can have imprinting experiences after that time, but it's less common. Psychedelics reopen those critical periods of plasticity, and that gives us an opportunity, but it's not a guaranteed healing just to take the thing. And that's what's really important to know. Like even my teachers that I learned from in the Indigenous world were not saying, oh, they don't call them psychedelics, they call them master plants. And they did not say, oh, master plants are good. And they didn't say master plants are bad. They said master plants are powerful. And I would submit that all of these different kinds of medicines that open these window periods of plasticity in this very particular way require a lot of care and a container that allows us to not be re-traumatized because the experiences are not always easy. Imagine thinking about, and maybe you'll have insight and maybe you'll have healing and comfort, all of that, but the experience has intensity. That is the nature of the mystical experience that comes along with these kinds of medicines. And it's part of what makes them healing is that mystical experience, which by definition will be intense, even if it's the most wonderful thing. But often there's going to be challenge there. And so you always want to make sure that you have the right container, the right guide, the right setup, let alone, right, how you're going to access these things, because that's important too, right? And especially in this day and age. So you want to make sure all of that is being held so that you get the most out of the experience and have the kind of outcome that you may be hoping for.
And what is the difference between master plant and psychedelic? Is there a difference?
So master plants are considered in Indigenous society, and not that I speak for Indigenous people, but I've talked to many, many people and learned for a long time. So this is kind of commonly the way they'll speak about powerful plants that are not considered compounds, drugs, medicines. They're considered beings. They're considered ancient teachers, masters, who transmit age-old knowledge necessary to navigate being human, right? And they change our consciousness and our behavior. And so master plants are not all psychedelic. Coffee is a master plant. Cacao is a master plant, right? And I always use these examples because people will go quite a bit out of their way, let's say, to get their coffee, to get their chocolate, right? Like we're kind of run by them. They are powerful. They change our behavior. They change the way we feel. They change the way we think. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but they do change us, right? And all psychedelic flora, fauna, fungi, right? So it's not a botanical term. Mushrooms are under that category and, some of the animal medicines as well. All of those are considered masters. So if it's a psychedelic plant in any way, it is considered a master plant. So it's a very different way of looking at, it's a relationship in this case, right? It's not, I'm going to use this. It's not, I'm going to take that. It's a working with, it's a relationship. And so there's a lot of ways to engage in that relationship. That's not just having these big experiences necessarily, that can still be very healing.
And I love the way that you word that, because I think a lot of people jump right to the science of it. It's you go to a clinic, a ketamine clinic, let's say you go to a ketamine clinic, and that's very sciencey. You're going to be given ketamine, you're going to sit, you're going to have your experience. But again, it's very sciencey and how they explain how ketamine works. And you have a much more relationship mental emotional relationship explanation for what people maybe should wrap their heads around when they're going to do an experience like this, as opposed to just jumping, for pun intended, the part of their brain that's analytical and medical and science. We have to include everything.
And so in my book, I talk kind of about left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And one of the parts of that, right, is like we've become very like in the rational, in the linear, in the right. And that's kind of been unbalanced. It's an unbalanced way of using our brains. So there's this need we have for like the connecting the dots, the big picture, the mystical, this kind of other way of experiencing the world. And those two together are what really make like a balanced person and even a balanced society. So I think the reason people get into that sciencey mindset the minute they hear about psychedelics, whether it's right, even we call the psilocybe mushroom psilocybin. Psilocybin's a compound that's in them. And actually, there was just a study that came out, not surprisingly, that the whole mushroom has different and bigger and better effects than if you use psilocybin. Like, you know, we have this sexy name, the entourage effect, right? But it's actually, this is age old knowledge, right? That the whole being is going to have a different kind of impact than the drug, right, that we make of it. And the thing I want to say about this in terms of when people hear indigenous knowledge, they think, oh, this is primitive or this is kind of age old, right? Like it's an old wives' tale type thing. And you know what I would say is about 70 to 80% of pharmaceuticals in current use today in our society, including in the OR, including pain meds, et cetera, came from bioprospectors who went to indigenous communities, let's say in the jungle, and basically took that information and complex information. I want to say this wasn't just, you know, oh, this is whatever. It's like the way it was prepared and understanding that certain plants had to be injected under the skin to be effective, or like for ayahuasca, which is one of the master plants that I write about in my book, that it's a brew. Ayahuasca itself, everyone talks about it like it's a psychedelic. Ayahuasca is a brew, and it is not psychedelic alone. And this is what we know now, has an enzyme in it that actually blocks our ability to break down DMT in other plants that normally would be metabolized really quickly, digested, and in a matter of moments. So we wouldn't be able to have these experiences without the ayahuasca. But how did they know, oh, this is an MAO inhibitor and this has DMT and we have to like cut it and we have to, you know, brew it for hours and hours and hours. And then we mix this in. I mean, there was all this knowledge. So if you take any pharmaceutical or have ever taken any pharmaceutical or know about any pharmaceuticals, about 70% of that actually is derived from indigenous knowledge. And if you ask indigenous people, how do they know? How did they know any of this? They will say the plants told us. And, you know, for some people that might be like, you know, crazy, it sounds nuts. It's fine, okay? Because we're not taught anything like that. But this is why I called my book The Master Plant Experience, because it is about these masters. And, you know, we're happy to take the knowledge, not happy to take how they got the knowledge. But if you know anybody who's gone through an ayahuasca experience, a San Pedro experience, a mushroom experience, let's say versus ketamine or LSD or MDMA, right? These are all different psychedelics that have been used therapeutically. They will say, ayahuasca told me XYZ. The mushroom said, right? I have never heard, I myself, not saying it doesn't happen, I've never heard someone say MDMA told me or ketamine said to me. They'll say, in my MDMA experience, I understood that my mother really loved me, even though XYZ or, you know, et cetera. But they won't say the ayahuasca told me. And across the board, you will hear those words from people who have had plant medicine experiences. Again, it is still that same kind of knowing that these plants have their own kind of communication with us, that they are beings.
And I think that is just absolutely amazing. And it's something I feel has been taught out of us as humans in the 21st century, and something not everybody. I mean, I talk to trees and plants. I mean, completely just in my normal everyday, I talk to trees and plants. But I think for a lot of people, that's going to resonate. And especially, again, if you're considering, If you resonate with any of the autoimmune, the chronic, the neurologic issues that we discussed, the symptoms, and this is something you're considering, maybe to reframe how you approach it instead of straight medical, straight science, hard logic. Include it, very important. But as Dr. Maya is saying, there's a whole other side that we really have to look at, which then brings me to the idea of macrodosing, microdosing, and quantum, because that trips people up a lot of what they're doing, what's being done in the research, what's being done in these clinics, what can somebody do at home. So could you explain that to us?
Sure. So macrodosing is, I think, what most people think of when they hear psychedelics. They think of like the trip or the journey, right? And it's this big experience and you're out of commission and you have visions and, you can't go be in your car or go to work or parent your kids, right? Whatever during that time. So that is the bigger experience. And that's what most of the studies have looked at so far. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the smaller doses, like microdosing, which we'll talk about in a moment, that's sub-psychedelic, right? So you are taking a small dose and you can do your life. Well, because of the legality of psychedelics in various places in the country and the world, they're not going to give somebody a microdose in a study and say, go off and, do this. They're going to say, come into the clinic, right? And we're going to watch you all day. Well, most people are not going to come into a clinic and just like have a sub-psychedelic, experience where maybe they feel good, maybe they're focused, maybe they're creative, but they don't want to sit in like the clinic and be observed all day every 3 days when they're having a microdose. So the studies are limited in that. Now, I want to say, I actually think microdosing is the way that psychedelics are going to have the biggest impact in our society ultimately. I am not now knocking the large experiences. And I think that for some people, they are not just appropriate, but life-saving. Life-saving, and I think it is wrong to prevent people from having this kind of healing experience. And I think there are people who may not need that and can still experience a lot of the plasticity and the new connections in the brain through even microdosing experiences where it's a small dose, you're not having any visions or anything like that you can't control. You can drive, you can parent, you can go to work, but you're going to feel maybe a little happier, a little more euphoric in some cases, right? So people who have depression, people who have OCD, people who just like want to have that rewiring experience. It's being looked at for dementia. It's being looked at for autoimmunity. It's being looked at even for asthma. I could go on and on and on this list for physical conditions. So, and I go obviously much more deeply into the physiology and action of psychedelics in my book. Like obviously we can't get into all of that right now, but microdosing is something people can do at home. Obviously, there are some areas where it's decriminalized or even legal and it's becoming more and more and more. But, those are things we have to pay attention to as well, right? Like, is it legal in our area? And then finally, there's quantum dosing. And quantum dosing is a vibrational dose. So quantum dosing is legal for anybody, anywhere. And it is safe because it's vibrational. And so it's of the category of like homeopathy or flower essences, but it's different because these plants are different. And so the kind of, you're working with these particular kinds of beings that are altering the way that we operate. They actually can be very, very, very impactful in a vibrational way. So we developed something called quantum drops, and quantum drops are made in ceremony with the plants, and I grow these plants, but I don't consume my plants. So this is like, I tend them. We make this vibrational medicine from the music of the plants, the oscillations of the plants that are measured and translated into music with a device and medicine songs and, an altar and other things. And what it turns into basically is this very potent, but gentle at the same time medicine, which is safe. And so people don't have to worry about, again, not being able to do their lives, and they don't have to worry about the legality part. And, it's really powerful for people who are sober, who are pregnant, who are medically or psychiatrically fragile, or who are just plain old sensitive. Like my whole practice For much of, the decades, we're all like what I call people who can hear a bee sneeze 3 miles away, right? And for those people, sometimes starting by building this relationship with the plant in a vibrational way, and we have grandmother, grandfather, and the children. So that's San Pedro. Grandmother ayahuasca, grandfather San Pedro, and the children are the psilocybe mushrooms. And so people can engage if they feel the call. And there's actually like this precedent in indigenous practice, longstanding, working with vibrational medicine. Like in an ayahuasca ceremony, there are something called icaros. And the icaros are medicine songs sung by the maestro, the ayahuasquero who's running and holding the ceremony. And he or she would have learned or been given these, what are considered vibrational transmissions from the plant. They're not like their songs. They didn't compose them. They're vibrational transmissions, and they're considered to be as powerful as drinking the brew. And in some cases, they will not even give people the brew to drink. They drink a little bit of the brew and then they sing the icaros, and people will vomit, they'll cry, they'll have these huge healing experiences. So I think there are a lot of ways in with master plants, with psychedelics. I think it's going to unfold, hopefully in a really good way, but I think it's going to depend on people being educated, knowing how to engage, because things are always going to go a little sideways when something powerful, right? Like modern medicine doesn't know how to manage powerful things very well. Could talk about the opioid epidemic as one example of that. And money comes into it and hubris comes into it. There's a lot of reasons for it. But ultimately, this is why it's so important to me to be talking about this and educating people. It's not because I think everybody should do psychedelics. I think there's a lot of ways to engage if you feel called. There's no shoulds here. Don't do it just because you think you should. And make sure that you're educated, right? Read my book, read about it in other places, really, really think about it and prepare yourself. It's an undertaking. It's important. It can be life-changing and it can be life-saving if you come into it in the right way.
Oh, I love that. This has been so enlightening. Dr. Maya Shetreat, tell everybody where they can find you. Tell everyone the name of your book again. Books. You are a multi-author, and more about where to find the quantum drops.
Well, so people can find me and everything I offer on drmaya.com, on my website, just drmaya.com. And they can find my book there. My most recent book, The Master Plant Experience, The Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics. And my first book, The Dirt Cure, which is all about healthy families and, getting dirt and healthy food and being out in nature. And quantum drops are also on my website or at quantumdrops.com.
Well, thank you again for coming, sharing all your knowledge. I so appreciate it on the Root Cause Medicine podcast. This is, like I said, it's been absolutely enlightening. And I think a lot of people have been curious, questioning, seeing the information out there, and having you to come on today and discuss it as well as you did, and then have your book as a resource is just a great direction for a lot of people to go. So I really appreciate your time and being on today.
Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Welcome to Root the Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.